All right, one question. Well, I have several, but I guess I'll just give you a couple. Um, One thing that I talk to people about a lot of times is the comparison of what we have here in the U.S. and what we could have better in a communist lifestyle.
Hmm.
And I get this. I'm bumping heads with people. They don't get it. They're just not getting it. And one of their things that they use for their argument is Cuba as a communist country, and I have to tell them that is not communism.
Hmm.
So my question is, um, what's the difference between communism that they wanted and the new communism that you have and that you talk about in your book? I haven't read it yet, but I'm getting to it. And can you give some details of how science is used to create this new communism?
Okay, I'll try. Well, the new communism is a continuation of communism since the time of Marx, who basically was the founder of communism. But, and without going into too much here, I mean, the original communism that Karl Marx brought forward back almost 200 years ago now was a scientific breakthrough. It wasn't just that he had an idea somewhere. I think about the fact that while he was involved in some of the struggles of his time back then, he actually spent more than 10 years in the library of a big library in England, where he was in exile, studying all kinds of fields, studying history, studying economy, studying politics. And out of all that, he developed a scientific theory of the development of human society and its interaction with nature, with the rest of the world. And that was overwhelmingly scientific, but like every science, there were also things in it that were incomplete or even have proven to be not quite accurate. And plus, the world keeps changing. Marx expected that socialism and communism, or the communist revolution, would come first in Europe because it was the most highly developed capitalistically, and that the contradictions between the exploited working class, the proletariat in Europe, and the capitalists would explode and would make possible a revolution. And that didn't happen for a number of reasons, including because capitalism developed more fully into a worldwide system where it was able to exploit people, even more intensely in a lot of these third world countries, and use some of the profits from that to kind of pass out what you could call them bribes to the exploited people inside the countries like Great Britain, for example. So, that had to be learned from. And, other people came along, Lenin and Mao, who drew lessons from the way the world was changing. And at a certain point, after, first there was I'll get to Cuba in a minute, but after there was a revolution in the Soviet Union, they had socialism from, the more or less 1920 till the middle of the 1950s, until they went off the track and brought capitalism back. And then in China, they had a revolution which succeeded in 1949, and they had 25 years or a little more of socialism there until after Mao died. These people who were basically capitalists, calling themselves communists, took over and took China back to capitalism. So, there was at a certain point then, after that whole experience of what I've called, the first wave of socialist revolutions in the world, it was a need to step back and say, well, what's happened here? Why did we suffer these defeats? What are the positive lessons? What's the positive experience and the positive lessons that need to be drawn from the experience in the Soviet Union and China? And what can we see, looking back on it, but just also digging in, scientifically to determine, well, what were the shortcomings? What were the difficulties they were up against? What were the shortcomings in the way they dealt with those difficulties? And what can be learned from that? And I would say that what is the core thing is of the new communism is, as we've said, putting communism on a more thoroughly and consistently scientific basis. And by that I mean that science, first of all, is evidence-based. It isn't like you have an idea and I have an idea and she has an idea and he has an idea, and everybody has their own ideas and there's no way to choose among them. It's let's go into the real world and dig into it and see, like for example, I use the example of in Revolution Nothing Less of the Rosetta Stone, where they discovered this tablet that had, ancient Egyptian language and also Greek, if I remember correctly. And because they knew Greek, they could then see what the Egyptian, they didn't understand the Egyptian language before that, but because they could keep comparing it to the Greek, they learned the basic rules, if you will, of the Egyptian language, and then they were able to, unravel the mystery of Egyptian language and read a lot more things. Now, some of it was boring, like how much corn was produced in this harvest or whatever, but there was other things that were more interesting. My point being that was a scientific approach. They didn't just make up what they thought. Oh, I wonder what this Egyptian pharaoh was thinking. Well, maybe he was thinking this. No, they actually did the work of proceeding, to dig into the, using the Greek that they knew to actually work. It took a lot of work to figure out what these symbols in the Egyptian language meant by comparing them to what the Greek said and being pretty confident that this was two versions of the same thing. It wasn't one story or one narrative in Egyptian, ancient Egyptian, and one in Greek. Well, that's an example of being scientific. And then, they had to test it out. They had to see if it actually made sense, what they were saying. Did it? And then they had to, have other people who were experts in the field look at it and see if what they'd come up with was consistent or were there holes in it. See, one of the things about science is what's called falsifiability. That if you're if you have a scientific theory, then it should stand up when it's tested against the real world. And so things have to be both reviewed by people who are knowledgeable in the field, the particular field, but also it has to be tested in the real world. Like, if you predict, let's say that in the field of meteorology, just to take something simple, if you predict it will never again snow, the weather patterns have changed, it will never again snow. And if it snows on Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday, then people are going to say there's something wrong with your so-called scientific theory. Because it said things could never happen, which in fact have happened. Now, sometimes you might make a prediction that's basically correct, but certain parts of it are not completely correct. So then you have to adjust those, but it doesn't mean you have to throw out the whole theory if the core of your theory still is being borne out in reality. So it's an evidence-based thing, and it's science, and it's something that gets tested against reality. And you also have to look for patterns in reality. You don't just look at, okay, this happened and that happened, but does it happen repeatedly? Is there a certain thing that happens repeatedly, or is this just something that happened once and it really doesn't represent any kind of pattern in reality? So, you look for the patterns in reality, then you draw conclusions from what you see happening repeatedly. And also, what are the exceptions? Maybe the exceptions shine some light on things too. So then you systematize that into a theory, and then you go and you test it. Well, this is what some scientists say that you can't apply science to human beings and their society and so on. Well, why not? Human beings and their society are just part of the reality that planets are part of, or the galaxies are part of. It's just all reality. So you look into what actually happened to be scientific. What actually happened in these societies, for example, these socialist societies? Where were their ideas on target? Where did they make mistakes? How did they deal with the very difficult circumstances they were up against? What did they do correctly? What can you see that should have been done differently? What did they think that would happen that was not borne out in reality? Why was it not borne out? Was their thinking correct, but the world changed? So what they originally thought would happen would have happened for a while, but then when the world changed, it wouldn't happen anymore? Or were they wrong altogether? In other words, were they just off, and what they predicted would happen would never happen, or it would be very different? So, you apply the same principles of science to actually look at the experience of human society. Why does capitalism act the way it does? Is it because you have the wrong people in positions of power? Is it because some supernatural beings are controlling things? Or can you look inside the actual way that capitalism operates to understand why things go the way they do under capitalism? That's being scientific. Rather than just saying, I don't like this and I don't like that, you actually say, okay, how does this system of capitalism actually operate? What I was doing at the beginning of the first part of this talk, talking about these 5 stops and why you can't reform them away, was actually going through the contradictions that are built into the system. How did the system actually evolve? Why do we have the white supremacy we have? Why do we have the male supremacy we have? What are the actual real-world factors that led to these things? As opposed to, we have white supremacy because white people are all fucked up. Well, okay. I mean, yes, most white people are all fucked up, So are a lot of other people, by the way. But most white people are all fucked up. But then is that a cause or is that effect? Is the fact that most white people are messed up, is that why we have a bad society? Or are most white people messed up because we have a bad society? See, those are two different things. You have to actually look down to the real, the fundamentals to see why did things turn out the way they did? And same thing with men. Well, men are just that way. And is that why we have, such terrible oppression of women? Or is it because, the society we have actually leads men to be messed up in a lot of ways and to act badly? And that one leads you to conclude that you can't do anything about it. Now, here's a tricky thing. You can't come to the conclusion that it's the society and not the people, because if you come to the conclusion it's human nature, then you can't do anything about it. And you don't want to say you can't do anything about it, so you got to say it's the system. That's no good. That's not scientific. People have said, for example, when all this stuff came out in the 1990s about how supposed scientific proof by this guy Charles Murray and another one, that supposed scientific proof that non-white peoples are intellectually inferior. One of the leading scientists, Stephen Jay Gould, said, if this were true, we would just have to learn to live with it, but it's not true, and here's why it's not true. Rather than saying, it's bad if this is true, so it can't be true. No, this is really important difference. In other words, that's the point from the Ardea, the Ardea skybreak thing. That's bad science. You can use good science to prove that it's all wrong, that it's not true. So, the reason that we say it's the system and not just that people are messed up is because we've actually looked deeply into how does the system work, and what effect does that have on how people think and act. Does the system work the way it works because people think and act in bad ways? Or do people think and act in bad ways because of the way the system works? And it's not just we like one version better, but one of them actually is scientific. What does that mean? It actually conforms to the way reality actually is when you dig into it and look into it. And there were ways that the communist movement got away from that. There were ways that the communist movement developed, for example, its own version of identity politics. People who are poor, people who are exploited, proletarians who are exploited by capitalists, are not only the good people in the world, but they're the ones who have all the wisdom. Because they're exploited, they know everything about what to do about exploitation. And so therefore, all you have to do is let those people get in positions of power and everything will be okay. No. Because what happens is if you don't change the system, then you put people in, does anybody know people who are poor and oppressed who want to try to become rich and fuck over everybody else? Or, you know what I'm saying? Yeah, there are more than one or two of those, right? So, you have to say, no, that's the problem here is not going to be solved by just changing the people who are in power. Or, the idea, well, this group of people is oppressed, so they understand better than anybody else everything about their oppression. No, because, they may know better than others how it feels and what some of the particular ways it comes down are. But what it all stems out of and what is the cause of all of it and what to do about it, that has to be determined scientifically. Okay. No, go ahead.
But one of the things that I also wanted to say about the situation was that Russia, China,
Oh yeah, I forgot about Cuba.
and Cuba were never communist
Well,
countries.
China and the Soviet Union were for a time.
Communists?
Well, they were on the road to communism. Communism ultimately can only be on a world scale because you have to get rid of, in order to have communism fully, you have to get rid of all the imperialists and exploiters all over the world. So you can be on the road to communism. They were on the road to communism for a few short decades, and then things got taken back to capitalism. Cuba was never on the road to communism because, look, let's look at it honestly. Cuba is a small island country, 90 miles from the U.S., the territory of the U.S., and with what? 10 million people now or something like that. It's a very small country, and it was right under the shadow of the U.S. And what happened was they had a revolution in Cuba, and the leaders of the revolution were influenced by communism. But they basically, what they did was they made their revolution they didn't talk about communism when they were making their revolution. They kind of hid that. And they sort of acted like they had a brutal dictator named Batista who was installed and kept in power by the U.S. Things were so terrible in Cuba. I remember reading somewhere someone saying that in the old Cuban society, you could buy a little boy or a little girl for sex for $5. This is, and people were desperately poor and, and illiterate, no health care, all that kind of stuff. So they just basically said, we're going to make a revolution to deal with those things. Then when they came to power, after they overthrew Batista, and partly they overthrew Batista because the U.S. government wasn't really convinced that this was going to, that they were going to go in the direction of so-called communism. So they kind of let it happen. They didn't intervene right away, which they could have if they had more of a sense that this was something they really didn't like. So the people came to power, Castro and the others in Cuba. But they didn't really have any understanding of how to remake the society. They wanted to do all these things like give health care to the people, give education and make people able to read, all that kind of stuff. And they wanted to do good things, but they really didn't have any idea of how they were going to change the society. And immediately they came up against the fact that the U.S. was breathing down their neck and that they weren't going to get any help from, they couldn't get any help from the U.S. in dealing with these problems. So they turned to the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union had already gone back to capitalism. And so the Soviet Union kind of used Cuba as a colony. And that's where the whole thing came, where in 1962 you got the whole Cuban Missile Crisis, where Castro figured that the U.S. had already tried to invade Cuba and overthrow the Castro government in 1961. So Castro figured the only way he was going to prevent them from doing it again and being successful was if he got the Soviet Union to go all in with him. So he actually convinced the Soviet Union to put nuclear missiles in Cuba. Not because he wanted to attack the U.S., but he wanted to use, like the way it's happening with North Korea now. He wanted to use it basically as a bargaining thing to say, well, you can't invade me because then I can use nuclear weapons against you. And this almost brought the whole world to the brink of nuclear war in 1962. But the basic point, to simplify it, is that Cuba became immediately dependent on the Soviet Union, which had already gone all away from socialism. And so it sort of shaped Cuba into kind of a welfare state where they did some things to, improve the conditions of the people, but they were completely dependent on the Soviet Union, and they really didn't carry out any revolutionary transformation of the relations among people inside Cuba. So, and they didn't change the culture that was left over from the old society. They didn't change the economic relations, the social relations. There was still a lot of male supremacy that was going unchallenged in Cuba. A lot of backward things were still being carried forward. So it was a country that called itself communist or socialist, but it never really was, because from the beginning it became dependent on the Soviet Union, which had no interest in helping it become socialist, but just kind of wanted to use it as a pawn against the U.S.